In times of crisis, the job of any government is to get help to those in need. On the communications side, those governments also want to get ahead of the story, have it told their way to limit the political damage. We've been watching such a story unfold in central China, where a cruise ship called the Eastern Star capsized in the Yangtze River, killing a reported 431 people. Shortly after the news broke, journalists got their orders from Beijing, telling them not to travel to the scene, to rely instead on official press releases and state-run news platforms for information. And the result was evident in the coverage. News outlet after news outlet publishing the same photos, painting the same picture, sticking to the same script, reporting the story Beijing's way. China is a little more than 2 years now into the leadership of Xi Jinping. As the General Secretary of the Communist Party, he has centralized institutional power, and his approach to the news media is consistent with that. However, controlling information in the digital age, with news consumers growing ever more discerning, is far from easy, even in China. Our starting point this week is the Yangtze River.
Relief workers say it's a race against time.
Disasters and the coverage of them often follow a pattern. First come the details.
A major tsunami has struck northeastern Japan.
Then the numbers,
1,400,
which inevitably grow with each successive report.
Now over 7,200.
Eventually, the rescue effort is examined.
The communication is crippled.
The shortcomings of the authorities, if there are any, revealed.
That aid is not being delivered fairly.
That's not what happened in China. Within 12 hours of the boat sinking, Beijing laid down the rules. No province, prefecture, or city will send reporters to the scene. Those who have arrived shall be called back immediately. All media should run Xinhua stories and use CCTV footage, meaning there were just 2 approved news sources, both of them state-owned.
So after the Eastern Star sank, Chinese propaganda ministers, or as they're now known to these days, publicity officials, referred most journalists to report back copy from Xinhua or CCTV. And this is primarily due to, as they purport, to reduce potential for speculation and rumors, and which on the face of it obviously sounds like something that just for the social good, you're preventing misinformation from being spread. But obviously that has the counter possibility of controlling more information more closely.
After the media directive came out from Chinese central government, there were a series of identical front pages across a number of Chinese newspapers. These had the same photograph, the same headline, hundreds feared dead, and very terse reporting, very little in the way of questions, and a very strong play given to the notion that there had been a prompt and effective response.
It's not only a strategy, it's a tradition. It's a long tradition since the Communist Party came into power. They try to control media in this way. State-owned media is acting as a mouthpiece of the party. They want to show the good side, positive side of the event. It's a long tradition of the propaganda.
It's been that way for decades. There have been periods of relative journalistic openness. In 2008, when Beijing hosted the Olympics, restrictions on the global news media were loosened slightly, although controls on domestic journalism were intensified. Still, after the Sichuan earthquake that same year, the Chinese media were notably critical of the official response. By 2011, when 2 high-speed trains collided in Wenzhou, media directives were being issued from the capital, a reassertion of Beijing's right to control the story, even in the digital age, when information is harder than ever to keep contained.
We go back to the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, to the 2011 Wenzhou train crash. As for what lessons they might have learned from those 2 incidents with regards to the current sinking of the Eastern Star, I think they've recognized the fact that 2011 was a case where they weren't in control of the message on social media. And so in this current case, I feel like there's been a much more proactive stance to trying to shut down information.
The monopoly that the Chinese state once had over information is really lost in this respect. There's very widespread reporting, and the online sphere has really diversified that and changed that even more. So people really are sharing news in a way that they couldn't previously. Journalists are able to get leads in a way they couldn't previously. So in this context, it's actually very difficult to control the narrative. And I think for a lot of media consumers, they see through this quite quickly, and also very quickly get access to the other stories and the other conversations that are going on.
In addition to Beijing's efforts to control coverage of the Eastern Star, one of its papers, the state-owned Global Times, published an editorial saying the international media brought a biased approach to the story. The paper accused the foreign press of, quote, consuming the pain of the victims, of being eager to show the scars of Chinese society.
The editorial is trying to say most of the coverage of the tragedy from overseas media outlets are focused on the protest of the relatives of the victims.
We're not being allowed to film what is a peaceful protest of relatives,
instead of the rescuing work, and that is in sharp contrast with the work done by the local media. And here most of us are actually focusing, paying our attention on the rescuing work and different options of the how to lift the ship and everything in that aspect.
So the Global Times article calling out Western journalists was obviously propaganda, but at least in the eyes of Chinese citizens, you have many people wondering why Western journalists only cover the worst stories in China. Incidents like the SARS outbreak or the Wenzhou train crash or the stampeding, the death of people in Shanghai in the New Year's celebration in 2014. Western journalists, at least in the eyes of Chinese people, aren't really covering the many positive aspects of development in China, and they only focus on these negative tragedies.
China has a pattern of occasionally opening itself up to ideas that come from the outside world, before then turning back inwards. The media version of that goes back to 2008 and the Beijing Games, when the country revealed slightly more of itself to the global media, until the Olympic flame went out and all those reporters went home. And since Xi Jinping took control of the Communist Party in 2013, he has centralized power and rolled back the clock on journalism and freedom of expression.
I think it's clearly, based on the past 2 years, he's not been the reformer that people had thought he had been. He's tightened control over not just internet media, but traditional media. And whether or not this is merely a temporary effort to consolidate powers, or whether this is a permanent effort by him to prevent the sort of past spreading of free media that led to the downfall of, say, the USSR, is to be seen. But clearly, based on the trajectory of the past 2 years, things are much more difficult now for journalists and media in China.
The media and our society is more controlled than before. And the political atmosphere not as open as before, particularly the internet, for social media. Think about now we have more than 30 years opening and reform policy, but only one field was not open, that is media. Probably media is the last shield to keep the legitimacy of the Communist Party's power.
On the download this week, our viewers on the coverage of the news coming out of China.
Disaster reporting always works like this in China. Something bad happens, the top leaders are very concerned, and the soldiers during the rescue fight are very brave. Although journalists cannot report it on it freely, many of them are on social media, so they can probably reveal some of the unreported side of the story.
News media and journalists enjoy more autonomy in reporting on natural disasters such as earthquake and landslides than reporting on man-made disasters such as train crash and ship sinking. So the government issued a kind of propaganda order asking news media in China to follow the stories produced by the Xinhua News Agency and the CCTV. It is easier to control 2 media outlets than to control more than thousands of medias in China.